Hey, Nick is here, and today we are going to talk about Regulation S crowdfunding in the US. Reg S is an offshore regulation that provides an exemption from registration for securities offered and sold outside of the US for non-US investors. Companies opt for offshore transactions in two cases: if they want to attract non-accredited backers outside of the US, or if they want to avoid the headache related to the file filling and investor status verification. In addition, Reg S allows crowdfunding companies to collect money from foreign backers regardless of their income and net worth level. At the same time, Reg S securities are the most vulnerable because they provide very little info to their investors. There are two main rules for Reg S, 903 and 904. Rule 903 applies to the offers of securities made by issuers and distributors. Rule 904 applies to resales of securities that already have been issued. You don't need to register your Reg S offerings with the SEC, but there are methods and good practices that must be followed. To be compliant with Reg S, you need to follow two main rules. The transaction should be offshore, which means it cannot be made to a US person or someone physically. There can be no direct selling efforts in the United States, which means no advertising or marketing is allowed in the United States or aimed at the US investors. So, who can rely on Regulation S crowdfunding? The US and foreign issuers, distributors, affiliates of the issuer, any persons acting on behalf of the mentioned persons, non-US resident purchasers, or US residents. Keep in mind that if you are offering and selling securities outside of the US, you will have to comply with local and national regulations of the third countries. Reg S offerings are often paired with Rule 144A. It allows companies to offer the same securities to US-based qualified institutional buyers, investing at least $100 million in the securities of the issuers not affiliated with the entity. Rule 144A is a highly attractive opportunity to raise capital. The filing requirements are quite nominal, and issuers can make their offerings public with very little upfront expenses. So, let's have a brief look at the key features of offshore transactions. They are conducted using general solicitation and advertisements. Issuers don't necessarily have to be aware of the status of the investor. Offshore transactions can be paired with Regulation D offerings. There is no limit on how many investors can take part in the deals, but they all must be outside of the US. Securities are generally sold at the very large discount of the market price, sometimes up to 80%, and the distribution compliance period depends on the category of transactions involving debt and equity securities. Now, how to start Regulation S crowdfunding platform? The good news is that crowdfunding companies can conduct offshore transactions without SEC registration. Typically, companies integrate other methods like Regulation D Rule 506C to raise capital alongside Regulation S offerings. Crowdfunding attorneys advise the issuers to make two separate websites. One will serve for the Rule 506C and the other for offshore transactions. Also, it would be a great idea to make the Reg S website invisible in the US. The website for Regulation S should have proper disclaimers in place and a verification module that would allow you to check whether the investor is based outside of the US or in the US. So, let's talk about requirements for offshore offerings. You need to disclose any bad actor incidents and submit a registration statement together with a prospectus. Due diligence procedures should be done by underwriters and the counsel on the transaction. There should be comfort packages from outside the US counsels to provide underwriters with adequacy of the disclosure. The SEC carefully validates the records from the registration statements and checks it for inaccurate and hidden info. In future, those statements often become public on the SEC EDGAR platform. So, are there any downsides for offshore transactions? Well, yes. The process can be extremely expensive due to accounting and legal fees plus ongoing costs. Filling the registration file can take longer because the document contains around 100 pages. And Reg S securities must be issued for at least 1 year and then resold in the US under the provisions of the Rule 144. So, let's recap. If you want to extend your crowdfunding business under Regulation D and make an offering for foreign backers, then Reg S is the right choice. Keep in mind that offshore offerings are made exclusively for non-US backers. The SEC doesn't require any specific registration for offshore crowdfunding. The only requirement is not to advertise and make offerings for US citizens. The common practice is to separate Regulation D from offshore transactions and develop a separate website for them. So, check the link in the description for more information about Regulation S crowdfunding, as well as a proper software to help you build a crowdfunding platform. Thanks for watching and see you soon!